Matt, we get to do this again. I'm so excited. You're the one who introduced me to Miguel de la Torre's work. And I think I never asked you how you discovered him in the first place.
Well, like so many things that we are reading these days, he came to me through just a casual mentioning by David Roberts. We were sitting around a table as we were preparing for the I and Love and You series. And I was asking, does anybody have good resources around conversations about progressive theology meets sexuality? And he said, I've heard good things about Miguel de la Torre. And so I just kind of checked out what he had been writing about. And the title of his book just completely sucked me in, Liberating Sexuality, Justice Between the Sheets. And so the title was very intriguing, and I couldn't put it down. It was so captivating and so, and I don't know if this is appropriate or not, but erotic, like the things that he was writing about in commentary or commenting about around the Song of Psalms. Like literally I was sweating reading it. It was that provocative, but just so insightful and so far beyond, I think, what our community was used to hearing. And so I dove in and I read the whole book cover to cover in about 2 weeks, and then it really informed me that series. So that's a long explanation, but that's how I found out about him and started kind of learning about his work. What excites you about this morning?
So I'm fully expecting the comments thread to just blow up this morning. He's so unapologetically himself, and so I think his comments are going to give us a lot as a community to think about. I remember when I was first reading his work that you introduced me to, it took me aback a second because he's using secular language in a way to address this biblical lens that I had just never come across before. And so that was pretty mind-shattering in good ways. But it did kind of take me aback. He's a bit of a live cracker. I think he's going to be exciting for us this morning. I hope I can keep up.
Well, yeah, that's you read my mind, because what we've done in the past is we've sent our 4 to 6 questions to whoever it is that we're interviewing and saying, here's kind of where we're going to go. And he said, don't do that. Just fire away and let's see what happens. So we are in uncharted waters here a little bit, but it should be fun. And maybe, are you ready to get him in here?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it. Well, good morning, Miguel. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you. Yourself?
I am doing great. You're logging in from Denver, Colorado, the Mile High City, right?
Absolutely. Rocky Mountain High.
Rocky Mountain High. You're not from Denver, though.
No, I'm not. I'm from Cuba originally.
Cuba. So I want to jump right in here in just a moment, but just to kind of revisit how we came to know about you, we did a series earlier this year called I and Love and You. It was a relationship sexuality series, and one of our staff pastors recommended your book, Liberating Sexuality, Justice Between the Sheets. The title just sucked me in, and then I ended up reading that entire book cover to cover in about 2 weeks, and just not just the provocative nature of how you wrote, but some of the progressive ideas around sexuality were just absolutely staggering. I don't think I've quoted books or authors here at Watershed for 15 years. I've never had more emails in my queue asking the question, what was the name of that book again? Because I want to pick that up. So that was a real popular moment for us here at Watershed. One of the questions that we always ask our authors here, because not everybody's familiar with their work, but in order to kind of get to know you, could you answer the question, who is Miguel de la Torre to Miguel de la Torre? How would you respond to that?
I would say in a nutshell that I'm a social activist, really more a scholar activist. That is that I'm first and foremost a scholar. But that scholarship is informed by my activism, by the work that I do within the community and into the stories of individuals within the community. But I want to emphasize the scholarship because I've published, close to 40 books now, yes. All dealing with issues of ethics and morality and social issues. that are impacting individuals specifically from marginalized communities. So most of my work, I would say, approaches some of these social issues from the perspective of people of color, the queer community, women, not to speak for them, but rather to emphasize the voices that are already speaking in these areas. And more importantly, to speak, when I do speak, to speak of how I am complicit with the structures that create those the oppression of these groups.
Wow. And my understanding is, like, you didn't start this work in like your 20s. Like, didn't you kind of go through a process of going, oh, wow, there's something here to see that I haven't been seeing? We kind of share some similar roots. You're Southern Baptist, Kentucky. You were a pastor in Kentucky for a while. I'm from
Yes.
Kentucky. Yeah.
Well, I
So
mean,
you woke up, right?
yes, no, quite frankly, I began my early life as a capitalist. I had a real estate company for a good 15 years in Miami, Florida. And I was a very right-wing conservative in my political views. And in fact, I ran for public office at one point. And in fact, the reason why I ended up going to seminary was because during the 80s, when I was around 30 years old, there was this movement of bringing the church and politics together and save America for Jesus type stuff. So I was part of that. However, when I was at seminary, as I was listening to our class lectures on Karl Barth and on Bultmann and on Moltmann and all these great German names, none of it really resonated with me. So I went to the library and I started pulling out all the books that had Latino names, not knowing who Gustavo Gutierrez was, not knowing who Bonino was, all these giants in liberation theology. And that really began my conversion towards a more liberative way of dealing with God and religion. And again, this is happening now in my mid-30s, much later in life. I was a Southern Baptist, not from the beginning of my journey. I was a Catholic and part of Santeria, and became a Southern Baptist when I was in my early 20s, when the girl I wanted to go out with would only go out with me, or I went to church with her on Sunday, and she happened to be a Southern Baptist. So that's my introduction to Protestantism, but I remain a Southern Baptist anyway. Basically, because I was at seminary, I realized no Southern Baptist church was ever going to hire me as a pastor when I graduated. I mean, I did pastor a church and they got rid of me very quickly because of my views. So I did what every unemployed grad student does. I went ahead and got my PhD and then ended up now teaching at a theological school. So in a nutshell, yeah, it's an interesting journey.
So, like, we can't focus on all 40 books, but there are two that I'd like to try to live in for just a moment, and hopefully we can get to both of them. But the two are, namely, Burying White Privilege, Resurrecting a Badass Christianity, and Embracing Hopelessness. And if we could begin with burying, I'm going to butcher that the rest of the day, Burying White Privilege, Resurrecting a Badass Christianity. From what I understand, this book was an essay that went viral, and then it became a book.
Right.
Now, granted, like, we're in the unprecedented times, and this book was written before any of what we're going through now has transpired. But what is the centering idea of that piece, and why do you think it resonated with people so deeply that it went viral?
Yeah, definitely. The book was written like I think a month or a few weeks after the 2016 election. Not the book, I'm sorry, the essay was written like a couple of weeks after the 2016 election. And as we know, white Christianity was very instrumental in electing our current president. When you start looking at the numbers, 80% of white evangelicals voted for our current president. And that got me really wrestling with the fact that white Christianity is really detrimental to communities of color. White Christianity has nothing to do with Christianity. And in fact, if we want to get saved, we have to let the dead bury the dead and let white Christianity not only die, but basically dig its graves. and move on to any type of faith that's rooted within communities of colors, those who are suffering. So in a way, what I'm basically saying is that those of us who are on the margins of society must reject this white Christianity. And we must instead embrace the Christianity of our own community and how we understand the gospel message. As a follow-up, in I think January of this coming year, I have a second book, which is the second part of that first book that you mentioned. And it's going to be called Decolonizing Christianity, Becoming Badass Believers. And the idea then is to take this first book to its logical conclusion now that we've had 3 years of this present administration, and begin to argue that there is this merger between white supremacy that was seen in some of the militia groups and the Christian foundation that white Christianity provides these type of hate groups.
So if someone wanted to start to do that work, can you point us to resources about how does one read the Bible from that lens of liberation? Or can you reframe one of the stories for us to give us an example of that? Maybe for someone for whom this might be really new.
Okay. So let me refrain the story of the vineyard owner, for example. That's a parable we're all familiar with. So as we know, the patron goes out looking for workers, and at 6 a.m, he finds some Latinos over by the Home Depot, so he sends them to his field to work. At 9 o'clock, he sees some more Latinos over at the bodega, so he sends them to his field to work. At 12, 1, and 3 o'clock, he comes across other Latinos who weren't working all days, and he sends them to his fields to work. And they all work all day, and then at the end, the patron's going to pay them all. And he begins with the last and gives them the same amount of money than he does the people who were working since 6 a.m. Now, for white Christians, we read that story and we probably say, boy, Jesus is being very unfair. I mean, you had these people come in, at the end, 1 hour before the shift ended, and they're getting paid the exact same amount of money as people who have been working since 6 a.m. So we automatically read that as somehow unfair. So we try to save Jesus from being unfair and say something like, well, Jesus is talking about heaven. Doesn't matter when you accept Jesus. You all go to heaven. You accept him when you're young or when you're old. It doesn't matter. And that sounds nice, but that has nothing to do with the story. And this is the part of the problem of reading the Bible through the eyes of white males who have bought into the capitalist paradigm that dollars equal time. So for us, fairness is if I work 1 hour, I get paid $20. If I work 2 hours, I get paid $40. And that's our definition of fairness based on the capitalist Eurocentric paradigm. But I think Jesus was trying to teach us, because he's talking to migrants, he's talking to people who are unemployed. And he's basically saying that only a cold-hearted patron would send away his workers with not enough money to be able to eat and feed their family that day. That somehow, if you work for me, I, as an employer, have a responsibility to make sure you have enough money to survive those next 24 hours to come back to work with me tomorrow. And it's not your fault if I didn't show up to hire you earlier in the day or later in the day. You were where you were supposed to be looking for work. And so it changes the paradigm from money equals time to I have a responsibility, you have a living wage. And this is very, very critical in a time when we have words like the working poor. This idea that you can work 40 hours, you can work a full day and still be poor because you don't get paid enough money to survive. So really what the story has nothing to do with, how many treasures I'm going to get when I get to heaven. It has to do with the economic structures that this country has failed to live up to. So that's just one quick example of how we could read the biblical text through these eyes. Resources, There's many great books written by biblical scholars of color that help us interpret the biblical text this way. I did not come up with this interpretation that I just gave. Obviously, I read it from some of these other books. In a shameless act of self-promotion, I could point to two books that I published. One is called Reading the Bible from the Margins. It was one of the first books I've ever wrote, and it has been really one of my most popular ones. And the second one, I wrote a commentary on Genesis, like about 500 pages long, that goes through all these stories, reading the biblical text in this fashion. Oh, and the third one, I almost forgot, The Politics of Jesus, which is reading the gospel, the four gospels, using this type of hermeneutics.
Wow.
I think,
no, go ahead, Tom, please.
I think that's great. We, as a community, have been talking about how we must come around and disrupt these long-held narratives that are untrue. And I think that your example and then the resources that you so wonderfully pointed out really speak to that. Disrupting narratives and elevating marginalized voices has been an imperative for us at Watershed. So I appreciate that example.
My pleasure.
At one point in this book, and this I think this might be like someone might gasp listening to what I'm about to ask, so I'm going to ask it anyway. At one point in bearing white privilege, you white Christianity to the satanic.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in my Baptist Christian tradition, that was always, the satanic was always something you pointed at within secular culture,
mm-hmm.
Music, entertainment, even the political. Can you talk a little bit about what that term means, the way that you use it, and why you feel like that's such appropriate language?
Oh, absolutely. And again, obviously, I'm channeling James Cone when I say this. James Cone, back in 1969, said this in his book, Black Theology of Liberation, in where he called white Christianity satanic. Mm. And what James Cone meant, and what I mean, is that any Christianity that says nothing about children in cages today is not of God. Mm. Any Christianity that is silent as Black lives don't matter has nothing to do with Jesus Christ. It has to do with the devil. And the reason I say that is because if Jesus says in John 10:10, I have come to give life and give life abundantly, then anything that does not provide life and life abundantly is therefore satanic. And the white Christianity, which is dominant in this country, that instead of standing in solidarity with those who are being persecuted by immigration laws, by police brutality, instead provides a spiritual justification for these things, is from the pit of hell. Mm. So I'm very clear in taking this idea that James Cone developed decades ago and saying that it is more satanic now than even back then.
So it's fascinating because what I hear you saying is this isn't a new idea. This idea has been around much longer than you or I. Can we transition a little bit towards this other book that you've written called Embracing Hopelessness? Because when I hear you say things like this, and even in the conversation that we're having, only now, after probably 2 or 3 years, is there a bit of a stamina that I think our community is starting to experience, or at least our leadership and staff, so that when things come towards us, like some of what you've been discussing, there's this discipline of sitting with the disrupting nature of that and hearing it and going, all right, there's something that God is doing in the dissonance that we're experiencing communally together, and something we can inform from that. But there's also a sense that it's overwhelming. And I think as a white Christian, I was always taught to see things through this perspective of, there's all this glory, there's all this hope. God's going to fix everything in the end, and it's all going to be fine. And if I just do X, Y, and Z, then all things work together for the good of You get what I'm saying there. So, like, embracing hopelessness. Sell me on that idea, and kind of talk to me about what the base note of that book might be.
Of course. Hope is a white middle class privilege.
Hmm.
It is, because if I have enough money that my kids will go to college in spite of the pandemic, I could have hope. My privilege, economic and race and male, will provide me with hope to survive. But for the vast majority of the world, they may not live another day. Something like 2,800 children die each and every day of preventable diseases around the world. That's unacceptable. That's just unacceptable. And yet, for them, there is no hope. They will die. My privilege of living in this country will protect me from that, so I could then embrace hope. So basically what I'm trying to do is, how do we understand the movement of God when there is no hope for survival? And what I'm trying to argue is that hope becomes a way of domesticating the oppressed. Think of Auschwitz, the sign at the entrance of Auschwitz that says, "Work will set you free." We know it did not. But if I have hope that I could survive the concentration camp by keeping my head down, by not making waves, by not making trouble, then I do not rebel against the very structures that are going to kill me in the end. So what I'm arguing is that hope becomes a way of controlling people. But if I have nothing to lose, if I'm going to be killed anyway, that's when I become the most radical. And that's when structures of oppression might begin to crumble and change. But as long as I have something to lose, I'm not going to be too aggressive. I'm not going to upset the apple cart. So what I'm arguing is that by embracing hopelessness, not only are we in radical solidarity with the least of these, but also it becomes tremendously liberating, because it no longer depends on me. As we know, many people who get involved in social movements get burned out very quickly. And I think they get burned out because they think they're actually going to change the world. And then the world doesn't change and they get very depressed, and then they do something else. But for example, I've been working with immigration issues for almost 2 decades now. And it's gotten worse. And I'm okay because I never expected to win anyway. But I do what I do. I fight for justice, not because I think I'm going to win, and definitely not because I'm going to get an extra crown on an extra jewel in my crown when I get to heaven. I do it because it defines my very humanity, and it defines the faith that I claim to possess, regardless of the outcome.
I think what you described there is sort of a detachment from worldly things, and I would have never considered hope a worldly thing, but the way that you're framing it for me now, I think helps give credence to some of these movements where we see folks who stand at the front lines. I'm thinking of John Lewis, right? When he's urging people to get into good kinds of trouble. I see parallelism there, but you have this way of just turning something that you think is one type of phrase on its head and giving us a lot to think about. There's no question there. That's just a compliment. Thank you.
No, but let's talk about John Lewis, for example, and his good trouble that he talks about. One of the things that I argue in that book is for an ethics para joder. Now, for those who don't know Spanish, for those who know Spanish, I apologize for my cursing. But in Spanish, joder is a certain 4-letter word that you never use in polite conversation that begins with F and ends with K. And I'm calling for this ethic that screws with the structures, which what John Lewis did throughout his life. I'm not inventing anything new. I am basically putting words to something that oppressed people have always done. In the African American community, you have Bear Rabbit and Bear Bear. In the indigenous community, you have Coyote and Spider. And in our Latino community, we have Cantinfra. My Cuban community, we have El Egua, which is the Afro-Cuban god, that's the trickster. So if it's hopeless, And if I rebel, I may get killed. How do I screw with the system in a way that I could probably survive, but yet still move the conversation in a new direction? We have developed a system where I have to go to the police department to get a permit from the police department to protest the police department for police brutality. We have domesticated protests where I could go and carry a sign and feel good about myself, but yet change nothing. And the excitement of the moment we're living in, what you're seeing in Portland, what you're seeing in Seattle, what you're seeing in Austin, is that people are no longer following the rules, but instead of walking into the temple and overturning the bankers' tables. And that is what the gospel message is about. So I first embraced the hopelessness of the moment, which then leads me to a new way of doing radical ethics, in where I am constantly screwing with the system in an ethical and moral fashion. So really what I'm struggling is, how do I ethically lie to find out what is true? How do I ethically steal to feed the hungry? These become, because those who are oppressed, it's never a choice between right and wrong. It's always a choice between bad and worse.
Yeah.
So no, please continue.
No. And so the question is, I'm trying to move away from this ethics of just right and wrong, when there is no right, and when it's just wrong and wrong.
I think you're naming something that I've been experiencing in conversations with my friends, my family, even folks that are part of our community. You use the word domesticated, and it feels like there's this resistance to the to the revolutionary rejection of the status quo rules that feels like, for some of my white friends or white community members, the absence of domestication. Like, I'll hear statements like, what are we really doing here? What is the solution? Why aren't there other ways of provoking change that don't include the destruction of property, or don't include such divisiveness? Shouldn't we hear debate from all sides? And it's been interesting, because one of the questions that have surfaced for us is, how do you discern which voices that you're accommodating as you move forward? And for us, we've been trying to break this horrible history within even our own Christian expression at Watershed, to remove ourselves from it being white-centric. And our community of color here at Watershed, we need to hear from you. We need to center your ideas, your way of understanding this. But then the question surfaces, like, how do you figure out which voices within the community of color do you continue to include? Are there dissenting voices? Like, do you have any sort of advice or observations when you've heard those types of dynamics surface?
Absolutely. And Cynthia, you really raised a multitude of issues. So let me try to deal with a few of them as I can. So can we protest in a more domesticated, in a more peaceful, in a more loving way? Well, we've done that. We were, taking knees at football games, which was, it's very symbolic. It was just a symbol. And America freaked out and boycotting football games. And so no, the dominant culture does not want to hear what we have to say. So we can't communicate because no matter how we try to communicate, it's always going to be rejected. So we have to, that's what I'm talking about. That trickster image becomes very important. Secondly, can we hear all voices? I refuse to debate the skinheads and the Nazis and the neo-Nazis. Sure. Because number one, the dominant voice has been the dominant voice. And my voice has always been excluded. every time these conversations occur, people like me are not invited to the table. So when we finally get together and have a conversation, all of a sudden we talk about, well, we need to have all voices at present and we need to make sure everybody has equal time. So let me be very clear. When I wrote the book, Embracing Hopelessness, when I wrote the book on Burying White Privilege, I did not write it for white people. They are not my audience. I really don't care what they think. Well, I know what they think, so I don't care. I wrote it to other communities of color who are struggling with oppression. Now, if white people want to read my book and listen to the conversation that I'm having with other communities of color, they're more than welcome. They might learn something, but they are not my concern and they are not my audience. So what needs to really occur is for those who are on the margins to stop trying to talk to white people and learn to talk to each other. And I think you see that happening when in these protest movements, it's not only just Black Lives Matter, but we're also talking about the importance of immigration laws, because the same people, the same military who are on the streets in Portland are the Border Patrol agents who are on the border in Nogales. That this is all interconnected. And we're talking about listening to queer voices within our communities of color. So the conversation is now expanding, something I haven't seen before, and something that's very exciting. But we could only continue to do that if we speak among ourselves. And sometimes white people can't be part of that conversation. And I'm not trying to, be negative here, but it's like when women talk about sexism, the conversation changes if a man is present, because all of a sudden now all these women have to try to convince me that I'm not really that bad of a man, that I'm really one of the good guys. And I'm going to get very offended very easily when they just mention men. So it changes the conversation. We need our own space to strategize on how we bring about justice. And that becomes important. So that's why I'm writing these books. Am I the spokesperson? Oh, God forbid. I mean, believe me, I will be very scared if everybody agrees with me. But I'm just one voice that is really trying to tap into how communities of color and oppressed groups have always dealt with oppression. And I'm hoping it resonates with other groups. And if it does, great. But what we need to be careful of is when white communities, number one, praises us. If all of a sudden, if the white community loves what I'm writing, then I'm doing something wrong. Because, they're supposed to be more upset with what I'm saying than embrace me as the token spokesperson for my community. Hence, we need to be careful when the white community lifts up people to become our spokesperson. Basically, white voices speaking through brown faces or black faces. And we have plenty of politicians from sitting either on the Supreme Court or as our Secretary of HUD, who are these types of spokespersons for a community appointed by the white dominant culture. So it's messy. Definitely, we don't all agree. We're not a monolithic group, even within our Latinx community or the Black community. And we are struggling. But I think we can agree on one thing, and that is the present religious justification for the dominant culture that reinforces the present social structures are satanic and damning to communities of color.
Well, yeah, go ahead, Sean.
Sorry, I was going to say, I think what I hear in that is how critically important it is for marginalized voices to expand the canon. Because for a while, we were shut out of that conversation. We are not published as greatly as white authors. And so now we see this sort of surgence of voices adding to that canon. And there's got to be multiplicity of ideas and multiplicity of opinions there, and for sure not a monolithic. I worry sometimes that that's going to be the new wave, is that, oh yeah, I've read 2 Black authors, so I know about the Black Lives Matter movement, and not understand at all the nuances of it, or to read only one book on immigration is to wholly miss the entire argument or premise of it to begin with. So I agree wholeheartedly there that we need more voices and our own chat rooms, so to speak. Matt, sorry, I think I cut you off.
No, that's okay. That's okay. Well, one of the things that we feel like we're called to do, at least in this season, is hold enormous amounts of tension, because the truth that you're describing is something that we're having to trust will emerge as time goes on, as events in the world transpire, as we deal as a community that's predominantly white here at Watershed, and the church at large, as we deal with everything that you've just named, the satanic nature, the way that we've colonized. We asked this question recently of one of our guests, and I think it might be a good way to kind of wrap things up. There's been other times in history, at least in my lifetime as a 54-year-old man, where it feels like there's been an emergence of collective energy towards everything that we're talking about. And this time feels different, but I don't know how to trust whether or not it is. And I'd just be curious to kind of hear your perspective. Do you think we're in an era where there will be some larger sea change, or how are you testing the winds that are blowing right now?
So let me remind you, I am hopeless. So, and I say that because I also remember, I'm old enough to remember the 60s and even have been marching in the 60s, back when my hair was down to my shoulders. And these same hippies who don't trust anybody over 30, make love in the park, we're going to change the world, or now Tea Partiers, and the majority of them are. So the problem many times is that once we gain the powers of society, our views radically change. So this is why I hold on to this hopelessness. But I also want to say that, unlike one of the things I reject in my book, Embracing Hopelessness, is this idea of an upwardly movement of history, that somehow history is getting better and better and better. I ascribe instead to this idea that history is nonlinear, that we could have a great future and we could have a horrible future. So to your point, yes, maybe what's coming out of this movement that we're seeing right now may be something great. Maybe we may move towards something a little more just. But just because we move to something a little more just doesn't mean that we will, from that point forward, for the rest of history, maintain that justice bent that we now have. If anything, neoliberalism is 10 steps ahead of whatever movement we're in right now. They already have contingency plans on how to push us back. And we've seen it unfolding in places like Portland, in where the whole Black Lives Movement is right now in danger of being co-opted by the white anarchists. So yeah, it's messy. Do I have hope in the moment? No, not really. Life is messy, and the work for justice is messy, and we will never achieve it. And that's why we have to constantly be fighting for it. We may take a step back, but we'll be pushed back 2 steps.
But there's liberation in that. You talked about liberation, so which is different. I think we sort of amalgamate those two together sometime and think that we sensationalize the work as though somehow there's this Disney ending,
right? Exactly.
to it all.
Liberation comes in that I could continue fighting in the work and not get discouraged, because it doesn't depend on me. I'm not the savior.
Yeah, sure.
I just have to do what I've been called to do.
Miguel, thank you so much for your willingness to jump in and just share with us the work that you've been doing. If someone wants to kind of keep track of you or follow along, what's your official kind of platforms that you communicate or include people through?
Basically, I have a website. They can get a lot of information about me and a lot of some stuff I've written. It's, you know, a lot of my essays are there on that website. drmigueldelatore.com, just one word, and Dr. Dr. period. Dr. Miguel de la Torre, not the word doctor. Facebook, you know, I have, even though I think I hit my 5,000, people still can, you know, follow there as well.
Sure.
I'm trying to think what else. And my Twitter account, which I'm very bad at that, to be honest with you. But once in a while, I do put something there.
No problem. No problem. Well, thank you again so much for joining us. And
thank you.
Yeah. If the opportunity presents itself, we'd love to have you back sometime.
Thank you for having me. Look forward to it.
All right. Take care.